midst of another divisive election, and sometimes we Christians can get caught up in the partisanship and forget the biblical principles that should inform our voting and our call to reflect the love of Jesus. This week, we're talking about some key election issues, the biblical principles at stake, and how they inform our voting and our behavior. We'll be talking with Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond, the senior pastor of Bethel AME in Boston, Reverend Enoch Liao, pastor of Boston Chinese Evangelical, and Reverend Sergio Perez, senior pastor of Harvest Ministries of New England. Guys, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
So we're going to be talking about some key election issues to understand the biblical principles at stake and to evidence how we're disciples of Jesus. They'll know we're disciples by our love, by loving each other even when we disagree. But I'm going to try and generate some disagreement. And so I'm going to be a little provocative, teeing up each issue just to make it interesting. But let's start with the easy ones, and then we'll work our way to the more difficult ones. So issue one, we see the world differently. Arnold King argues that the left sees the world through the lens of oppressor and oppressed, and the right sees the world through the lens of civilization versus barbarism. Without regard to whether each side actually correctly identifies who's civilized and who's not, and who's oppressed and who's not, do you agree with the hypothesis? And can it be supported biblically? Ray, would you start us off?
Sure. Thanks for this opportunity just to reflect on this. And again, we pray, reflect how as believers, even believers standing in different places or seeing the world differently, we can do that in a way, as you said before, that really does reflect our connection to one another through Christ and our calling to reflect that in the way we conduct ourselves in the world. And I had actually wanted to maybe go back and take a look at Arnold Kling's hypothesis a little bit more carefully. So not having done that, I'm not attributing this necessarily to the, my agreement, disagreement with the hypothesis, but as you stated it here, I think that there's a powerful truth there. I might say it a little differently, and that is that people value or fear things more. I think both groups, the left and the right, I believe, value civilization over barbarism and freedom over oppression. But that said, they may weight them differently. So I would tend to say that they may be more concerned on the part of the left with the threat of oppression, and perhaps more concern on the right about the threat of disorder. Both groups value order, both groups value freedom, but they may weigh these things differently. And as I say to people a lot, where you stand has a lot to do with where you sit. The concerns about oppression are much more salient, for example, for me. That is, I'm a descendant of people who were formerly enslaved and who still, objectively, by any number of measures, find that it difficult for them, or more difficult, to make their way through our society as it operates. That's improving, that's getting better, but there's still challenges. And as I look through the scriptures, I'd certainly see scriptures that value order. Romans 13 is probably the best example where the Apostle Paul really talks about the importance of the established authorities. At the same time, perhaps, and this is just my lens, I see many more scriptures from Old Testament and Hebrew scriptures all through the New Testament, concerned about not oppressing the stranger, not oppressing the widow, not oppressing the orphan, not oppressing your fellow Hebrew with debt and confiscation of land, all kinds of things. So through my lens, I see a greater focus on oppression than on order. But that's not to say order is not important. It absolutely is. So yeah, I would say that the thesis, I would just tweak it a bit to say that I do think that there are things that people value more. And I can understand a person who's had personal experience of disorder and and the kind of chaos that it can introduce, and its relationship to oppression, order may matter more than not that they don't care about freedom or the absence of oppression, but order may matter a little bit more.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. Sergio, what do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you, Charles, for addressing these issues, which I think they are very important. Interesting that people say that if you want to stay away from conflicts, don't talk about religion and politics. But those are the things that influence the most. Those are really like some of the most important things that affect us, literally, I mean, our life with the Lord, and then, the nation that we live and the laws and the government, I think are very, very important.
Well, Sergio, we all know that Charles is a great risk taker. He likes to wade into dangerous areas.
I rush in where wise men fear to tread.
I know, but that's why I have my mouth full of water, because I hope our audience will be drinking a lot of water too. Just to swallow what we're gonna say. But anyways, so I think, which is not easy. I think it's not easy because there is so much passion, when it comes to politics. So may God help us to talk freely about this, and like you said, I also want to thank you because some of the podcasts that you recorded like a year ago or something, I pay attention to those, and instead of just listening to the things that I want to hear, I was able to expose myself to, different views, different channels, that they have different perspectives, and I think that's important too. Back to that hypothesis or thesis, I think it does reflect some truth, some realities, but still, I think it's still too narrow to say that, the left, which for me is almost, liberals, and then the right, almost like conservatives. I think it does reflect some of the realities, but there are other elements. There are other elements that I think also identified the left from the right. And one, for me, that is a really big one, is the existence of evil. By pure observations in different circles, different scenarios, I've seen that, most liberals, they don't have this clear concept of evil. I think the perspective is like, everybody's good by nature. Just don't provoke them. And if you treat them good, you make deals with any kind of people, they will respond good to you. And I remember some politicians, when they were asked, some candidates to the presidency in the past, they were asked this important question: what do you think about evil? And they didn't identify, evil as we know it, that it is in human nature. It's not just the fact that you will, treat people or even nations like Iran, we're going to be good with Iran because if we treat them good, they're going to be good to us and there's going to be peace in the world. Hey, there is something called evil, and it does exist. And I think that when you bring that into the equation, you know that there is evil, and humans, yes, we have good nature, but we also have this nature that is very dangerous, and we need to take care of. That's just one that I see. There's another element that is very important for us to, like what the left embraces and what the right embraces. And the second one, just real quick, is this constant redefinition of God's design, when it comes to families and marriages. It's not just enough to get some rights, but it's redefined, what is God's design for, men and women and family and marriage. And it's this obsession to redefine, almost like to fight against God's design and to do this constant experiment, what I call like social experiment with, God's design. So I think that's also part of the equation between, right and left.
And so you at one point said liberal. So I presume you put in that you'd be thinking of secular liberals do not see evil, as opposed to Christian who are liberals who I don't want to speak for Christians who are liberals, but I'm guessing they do see evil.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. And so Enoch, you want to jump in here?
Wow, sure. So again, like the other two guests, want to thank you for hosting this. I represent the classic American who has opinions inversely proportional to their knowledge and wisdom. So, so regarding evil, I think picking up where Sergio said, there is a tendency to avoid universal pronouncements of morality, unless you're talking about the other party. Then I think both sides typically can call the other side evil with no recourse to galvanize their base. I think that's a big thing of public discourse. We were talking about the debate before we came on. A lot of times what is said on social media is not to make a cogent argument, not to say they don't have one, but it's more to galvanize their base. Because if you can get your base to go and vote, you'll win. It's not about even my understanding of political strategy now is don't try to win votes. Just get the people who already believe your view to go out there and vote. That's a totally different strategy. And I think both parties say this. If we just got our X% of our base to vote more, we'd win this thing, which is another issue about democracy that we can talk about in another day. Getting back to the notion of the left seeing the world through a lens of oppressor and oppressed, and the right seeing the lens of civilization and barbarism, there is some historic sense to that, as I understand it. Let's start with what I think is the older one from a more Western thought. Civilization and barbarism, that's generally out of vogue now. I think no one would want to publicly, politically say anything's barbaric, because it sort of hastens, it brings to mind this sort of ethnocentrism of there's civilized culture society and then there's barbaric society, which goes back to how white Europeans looked at Latin Americans and South Americans and Africans. Interestingly, when they got to Asia, parts like India and China, they didn't call them quite as barbaric, but they weren't as civilized. And this notion is still today in modern American English, all sides. When we'll talk about something like opera and someone will go, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not very cultured. That's actually a fairly, that phrase, I'm not very cultured, I don't know fine food, or I don't know ballet. You could call that elitist. I don't mean to offend anyone, but that really comes down to the sense of what is culture? And culture is a particular group's understanding of civilization. Therefore, my culture is civilized, your culture is not, and that's where that phrase comes from. So I think unless you're talking to your base in New England, probably any politician is going to avoid that phrasing today. But to pick up the oppressor oppressed, that's absolutely, I don't think that's just a left thing. I think that's a progressive thing. We use conservative or liberal. My sense is a lot of folks also perhaps use the word progressive. Maybe some prefer progressive more than liberal in some ways. And so there's definitely a lens there of looking through that. That goes all the way back to, well, I guess more famously, Marxism or neo-Marxism. And I do think it is helpful, but I wouldn't contrast oppressor and oppressed with civilized barbaric today. Today, I think if you could call it historic or conservative or the right, they might not say civilized barbaric, because again, that sounds elitist and condescending and sort of ethnocentric, but they might say, you know, right and wrong, or they might say, you know, personal responsibility. So I do think it is helpful for me when I hear an argument to think through oppressor has to do with power and systems. It doesn't matter what the oppressor does if they are in a position of oppressing other people because of wealth or power. And therefore, arguments don't work if I just believe someone's an oppressor. It doesn't matter if the oppressor gave me some food that day, they're still an oppressor. And it doesn't matter if the oppressed try to do their best to work hard if the system or people knowingly or unknowingly are oppressing them. And so when I hear arguments or people say phrases, that is a hugely important thing. So whereas on certain places, perhaps on the right, it's like personal responsibility and individuality as opposed to systems and oppression. So one say, well, you know, you would have a better livelihood if you just worked harder, because I don't see you working hard. But the other side might say, well, I can work as hard as I want, but the system's against me. And now we get into the classic, at least how I see it, how sometimes right and left folks talk past each other. if your listeners were to look this up, I think we've talked about this. Jonathan Haidt, the Righteous Mind, that the moral foundations theory, as it's becoming to know, I think it is a helpful thing to think about it. In fact, like if I could be so evocative, I'm going to channel Charles. I look at this screen and I see 4 men, male of a certain age, in certain religious authority positions, 3 pastors, and a president of Vision New England. So right then and there, someone could say, well, these individuals must be people that someone thought might have something useful to say, or they're the only ones available, or these individuals are here because they hold positions of power in their institutions and structures, good or bad, right or wrong. So, when pick up a topic like homelessness, transitional people, unemployed, if you have an oppressor-oppressed mindset, you're going to promote very different policies. You're going to identify very different root causes. If you're going to say, we all have those opportunities, we just got to work harder and take our responsibility, again, you're going to have a different set of responsibilities. So I do find it, broadly speaking, helpful, but I do think that ethnocentricity is probably true to some degree in most of us, if not all of us. And so I do think there's that sense. And I also think, unless you're a white male, you're not allowed to say this, but I think at some point we might always think, I feel like the system is against me. I mean, I think everyone, doesn't matter your background, might feel that at some point, because there's always someone more powerful or some way the system you feel like isn't favoring you. So I think, humanly speaking, we can all relate to that. Although a cisgender white male may not want to stand up politically today saying, I feel oppressed, because, he may not do so well in the polls. But so I do think it is helpful. Broadly speaking, Marxism, oppression, liberation, that's where liberation theology comes more out of South America and Africa. And honestly, to some parts of evangelicalism, liberation theology is a bad word. But for other people, that's how they came to Christ. Of course, they're trying to understand liberation theology from a historic Christian, because certain brands of liberation theology, you don't need a literal resurrection. It's just the Exodus is an imagery of salvation. Whereas I think a lot of us here might say, no, there's a freedom in the aspect of the gospel, but there's also a crucified, resurrected Savior. So I do think there's a lot to be gained from those perspectives, but like everything, probably got to be careful to pigeonhole people or groups. And if I'm talking to another person, to think, okay, how much of this, how do they see this? What is the lens they're using? So I think it has 2 possible lenses that are not exclusive to the left and the right. I do think it's really helpful for me when I try to listen to people make their arguments or at least express their views.
Yeah, I've thought about it as, I think, it's not going to be true for all time and in every case and stuff like that, but it is, I think, a helpful lens. But I wonder how different it really is, because as I think more about it, the barbarian is the oppressor. If you look at October 7th, right, I think you look at that through, I think that's exactly how we've looked at it, is we've got a group of people who are looking about civilization, and Enoch, I agree, we won't use the words, but we look at it, and civilization was attacked by barbarians who were terrorists and just murdered men, women, and children. And then you have other people who are defending it as an act of the oppressed rising up against the oppressor. And that's where I say, I'm not sure we always have those, we would agree on how well we identify them. But at the end of the day, the barbarians were the ones doing the oppressing. And so is it different?
It's interesting. I don't know very many people, certainly in the U.S., except on what I would call kind of the radical fringe, who would excuse what Hamas did on the basis of oppression. Mm. And in fact, the word I think has been used, barbaric, has been used pretty correct, and it's pretty accurate. Mm. It's a little dangerous because, of course, that some of this, the barbarian, as you say, comes from the, related to the Rome, Latin word for foreigner, but that's a whole nother story, right? But in describing behavior, if we will, beyond the pale for humane and generally agreed upon norms in the world, it's not a bad word in that sense. And I think people have used it, for example, in the situation of Israel and Hamas. The overwhelming majority of people that I've heard express concern, and I'm not arguing that there aren't other people who may have said other things, the concern is was the response and the toll on people not in Hamas. In fact, people who had also been oppressed by Hamas over the past 10 years, who were not allowed to have free elections, who, because of Hamas's position, aren't able to get the aid that they need or rebuild their country. Other people, innocent Gazans in that respect, who never had a chance to vote, having once voted Hamas in, should pay the price at such a high level. And was that barbaric? And we actually have rules of war about this. How many civilians, non-combatants, can be sacrificed in the course of war? So again, it is a difficult situation, I think, and we'll continue struggling with it and working with it. It's not the first time, and probably won't be the last.
Sergio or Enoch, anything to respond?
Well, when it comes to those words, those terms, yes, I think it was Enoch who said that, probably we're not used to, hearing those in these conversations. I think there are other terms, but then I decided to do a little research of, why the right will see, the world through those lenses of, institutions, and then barbarism, and I think that it was Roger Scruton who helped me to understand that the reason why probably that definition was made was because in order for societies to create institutions, it has taken a lot of work, a lot of effort to shape up societies and to create institutions that will protect societies themselves and families and everything. And I think that Roger Scruton says that because it took a lot to create institutions, we need to be careful to protect them. Otherwise, we turn into chaos, again. So I think in that sense, I even though I haven't heard those terms, in this sense, but it makes sense why it is important for us to understand why there are some institutions and why they are important to understand it. And the reason why institutions were created was because of that, what I mentioned at the beginning, because human nature tends to just, for the sake of freedom, and just to live as, with as much liberties as they want to, without taking care of their neighbors. And then that's why institutions were created, like government and everything else. So I think in that sense, I think it makes sense why, the right protects, institutions the way they were formed.
Enoch, last word.
Yeah, I guess I'll say one more thing on that. And if I were to expose what is pointed out as a sort of a black eye for Christianity historically, is that the concept of civilization, and to come into a place where there is quote unquote no civilization, has been used in various ways. So my understanding is, as the settlers came through North America, there was a doctrine both by the government and by the church at the time, whether Church of England or Church of Spain. And it's like, if there's no civilization here, then we can claim this land. And part of it, kind of referring to where Sergio is some of those indigenous peoples, Native Americans, they didn't have some of the European trappings of institutions, such as, I don't know, more fixed buildings, or certain types of material technologies and things. And so actually, when I read history, my understanding is when the settlers came to this continent, they thought that the Native Americans were simple people without much civilization. So in the name of civilization, though they might not have used the word barbaric until they engaged warfare and some other things with the local peoples, they took lands and things like that. And we're still dealing with that today. Like, we could talk here, but I can think of my indigenous First Nation friends, I'd be like, well, civilization has been used to do all sorts of things. And I think as a Christian, it's one thing to say that a culture does not have or believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I do not need to therefore equate that with a barbaric culture or society. So I think there's a difference between, now we're using the word barbaric as in it's evil, it goes against good moral sense, which, as Ray already said, kind of that's how we called foreigners, right? Foreigners were evil and didn't have good sense. So the word has, some interesting historical baggage and etymology, but I think there's a difference between civilizations, the kind of civilization, what we measure, because I think certain cultures measure monetary wealth, generating more resources. Other civilizations, like, who cares? We're having fun. We can raise our families and we can enjoy life, and we don't really need those other pieces like that. And so, like you go to a place, there's not much civilization here because the huts and the structures are man-made or, made by hand. They're not machine-made. So, but I think in terms of Christians and politics, it might be helpful to distinguish between barbaric as this potent rhetorical word for evil and uncouth versus they're just different. Even if we do have differences on morality through those differences.
There's a book I finished reading over summer called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which does a great job of the history of explaining why some were more technologically advanced, which we then called civilized, and attributed it to aren't I smart, versus those who are not, and that there's a lot of good reasons why it played out that way. Beyond the people and the culture. Eventually culture comes into it, but I thought it was a fascinating one to understand how that played out. Join us again next week as we continue our discussion of being a disciple in an election year. Thanks for listening. To support this program and accelerate evangelism, go to visionnewengland.org and click on donate or click member to become a partner with us. This program is supported by the Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.
Hi, this is Adam DePasquale, and I serve as one of the association directors of Vision New England and a lead pastor at Walnut Hill Community Church. Earlier this year on Pentecost, Vision New England hosted our first virtual 24-hour day of prayer for the region. It was an incredible success as churches and organizations from every New England state signed up to take an hour of prayer. In this season of our nation, and with so much happening in New England, we believe that it's time once again for the Lord's Church to gather in united prayer. So join us on Friday, October 25th for 24 hours of virtual prayer. Visit visionnewengland.org/prayer to sign your church up to host an hour and find out more information. Together we'll humble ourselves, come boldly before our Lord, and ask Him to move in a fresh way. I hope you'll join us.